You think you know fear. You think you've seen what lurks in shadows. What if I told you there's something worse than the monsters of your imagination? Something that defies everything you thought was safe and real. This is not just a ghost story. This is a true encounter that will crawl under your skin and refuse to leave. The room goes cold. The hair on the back of your neck stands up, and your gut tells you to run. But where do you go when the horror is standing right in front of you? Welcome to Sinister Stories, the place where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. And tonight, we bring you a first-hand account that will make you question what's waiting in the dark. This is the story of Daniel, who came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. A towering figure in his relative's house, creeping through the hallway like it was hunting. If you're brave enough, stay with us. But before we dive into this chilling tale, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends who love Real's supernatural encounters. Trust me, you won't want to keep this one to yourself. As the video starts, you feel the tension build. Imagine yourself in Daniel's shoes, walking through a familiar place, thinking everything is normal. But then, a cold breeze rushes through the hall, and you start to notice the subtle changes. The lights flicker, casting long shadows on the walls, and an eerie silence takes over. It's the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the house itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this was the first sign that something was very, very wrong. As Daniel stepped inside his relative's house, an unsettling sensation crept over him like a heavy fog. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt oppressive, as if the air itself were thicker. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing him in with whatever waited in the shadows. It was the kind of place that would seem ordinary to anyone passing by. An old two-story house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown trees that cast twisted, skeletal shadows in moonlight. But tonight, something was different. The usual hum of distant cars or wind rustling through the leaves was absent. Instead, there was only an unnerving silence, broken occasionally by the faint creaks of the house settling. The hallway stretched out before him, long and narrow, with old wooden floors that groaned underfoot. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, curling like dead leaves, and the dim light from the single hanging bulb flickered intermittently, casting ghostly patterns on the walls. The farther he walked, the darker it became, as though the shadows themselves were closing in, swallowing the light. There was something unnatural about the darkness here, a kind of living void that seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. The house was a relic of the past, filled with antique furniture and the kind of family heirlooms that seemed to hold memories long forgotten. The smell of dust and age would fill Daniel's nostrils, adding to the sense of decay that seemed to permeate every corner. But it wasn't just the house's age that made him uneasy. It was the weight of something else, something unseen. Every creak, every shift in the house's structure felt deliberate, like it was watching him, waiting for him to go further inside. He passed by a large, ornate mirror hanging in the hallway. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the reflection, something tall, looming just behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but the hall was empty. His pulse raced as he tried to dismiss it as a trick of the dim lighting, but the cold sweat forming on his brow betrayed his unease. It wasn't just the mirror. The entire house seemed wrong, like a place forgotten by time, where things best left undisturbed had been awakened. The deeper Daniel ventured, the more suffocating the atmosphere became, as if the very walls were pressing in on him. At the end of the hallway was a door leading to the basement. Daniel had been here many times before, but tonight, that door felt different. It seemed to loom larger, the shadows pooling around it, as if the darkness itself was leaking out. He could feel the cold emanating from the crack beneath the door, colder than it had any right to be. The air grew heavier, making it harder to breathe, and the faint scent of something rotten teased his senses. For a moment, he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But he was drawn forward, compelled by something he couldn't quite understand. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, cold to the touch, like ice. As he gripped it, he heard something faint, almost imperceptible. A low, guttural whisper, as though someone, or something, was speaking just on the other side. It was then that Daniel realized he wasn't alone in the house. The whisper lingered in Daniel's mind, a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to crawl under his skin. His fingers froze on the doorknob, his heart pounding violently against his ribcage. The rational part of him tried to explain it away. Old pipes, the wind, maybe even his imagination. But deep down, he knew. This was different. Something was terribly wrong. The air around him had thickened, as if the very atmosphere had become oppressive, heavy with the weight of something unseen but undeniably present. He pulled his hand back, resisting the pull of the basement door, and turned away, his breath shallow. But as he stepped down the hallway, the sounds began. At first, it was faint, a soft shuffling, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. He stopped, straining to hear, but the noise was swallowed by the silence of the house. For a moment, he dared to hope it was nothing. He continued walking, trying to shake the growing unease that gnawed at his insides. But then it came again, louder this time, the distinct sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. Daniel's blood ran cold. The sound didn't belong here. He was supposed to be alone. His breath hitched, and instinctively, his eyes darted to the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges of the hallway. Something was moving in them. The darkness seemed to shift and writhe, like it was alive, pulsing with an invisible energy. He blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows continued to move, stretching and creeping closer, as if they were reaching for him. He quickened his pace, his shoes barely making a sound against the creaking wood beneath him. But the air felt heavier with every step, and the hallway seemed longer than it had before, stretching out impossibly. As he neared the living room, the temperature plummeted, so drastically that he could see his breath misting in front of him. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the cold sinking deep into his bones, unnatural and biting. Then came the unmistakable sensation that made his stomach drop, the feeling of being watched. His skin prickled as a wave of dread washed over him. He could feel it, like eyes boring into the back of his skull. Slowly, he turned, his body moving against his will, every muscle tense with fear. His eyes darted back down the hallway, toward the basement door. The shadows seemed thicker now, coalescing into a solid mass of darkness. But within them, he could make out a shape, a figure. Tall, too tall. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling as it crouched low, its form grotesquely distorted, limbs too long and unnaturally thin. It was there, standing in the hallway, just watching him. Daniel's breath hitched, and for a moment, his mind went blank with terror. The figure didn't move, but its presence alone was suffocating, filling the entire hallway with an overpowering sense of dread. It wasn't just the appearance, the gaunt, skeletal frame, the exaggerated, skull-like head that seemed far too large for its body. It was the sheer wrongness of it. It shouldn't exist, yet there it was, as real as the cold air surrounding him. The figure shifted slightly, the movement slow, deliberate, almost mocking. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, black voids, and yet Daniel could feel its gaze piercing him, seeing him in a way that made his skin crawl. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or look away. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of the house, but his legs refused to obey. Then, without a sound, the figure leaned forward, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, as if studying him. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, dark tendrils of darkness spreading outward, reaching for him. In that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't before, a primal, instinctive terror, as if he were prey, and the thing standing before him was a predator, toying with him before the inevitable. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, his heart racing faster than ever. He needed to get out, but he couldn't move. The figure's presence was like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. His vision blurred for a moment, the edges of the world growing dark. And then, with a flicker of movement, the figure began to move toward him, impossibly slow, its long, bony arms reaching out as it glided forward soundless, but with an intent that made Daniel's blood run colder than the air around him. There was no more denying it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it was coming for him. Daniel's mind raced as the figure inched closer, its bony limbs outstretched, like death itself creeping toward him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat growing louder in his ears until it drowned out every rational thought. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn and flee from this abomination that defied explanation. But his legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor by an overwhelming sense of dread. The air around him had thickened, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to keep him frozen in place. He was trapped in this nightmare, and the only question was whether he had the courage or the foolishness to confront it. The figure's eyes, or the empty voids where its eyes should have been, bored into him, pinning him in place. It moved with an unnatural slowness, as if savoring the moment, its gaunt, skeletal form nearly scraping the ceiling as it crouched low. There was something deeply wrong about its movements, something that sent shivers down his spine. Each step it took seemed deliberate, calculated, like it was playing a twisted game of cat and mouse, and Daniel was the prey. His pulse quickened, his breathing shallow, as panic began to take hold. He could feel his muscles tensing, the fight or flight response kicking in, but his mind was clouded with indecision. Should he run? Would that even work? The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly behind him, as if it would never end no matter how fast he ran. And there was something in the way the figure moved, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of reality. Could he even escape it? For a moment, he considered simply bolting out the door, crashing through it if necessary. But what if the figure followed him? What if it wasn't confined to the house? Could he really risk leading this thing out into the world, letting it loose where it could follow him forever? His thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and confusion, but in the midst of the chaos, one thing became clear. He couldn't leave without knowing what this thing was. He needed answers, even if it meant stepping closer to the very thing that terrified him most. But the terror was suffocating. His mind flashed with memories of horror movies he'd seen, the foolish characters who ventured toward the monster instead of running. Was he about to make the same mistake? The figure continued its slow advance, its long, twisted fingers almost brushing the walls as it moved. Daniel could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold seeping into his bones. His breath came out in shallow puffs of fog, the chill wrapping around him like a vice. Time seemed to slow, every second stretching into eternity as the creature inched closer. But then something shifted inside him. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his sanity, but beneath it, a flicker of curiosity sparked. What was this thing? Why was it here? Was it a ghost? A demon? Something else entirely? The need to know, to understand, pushed him forward, even as his legs trembled with fear. He knew it was insane, but he couldn't just run blindly into the night, leaving this mystery unsolved. He had to face it, no matter how terrified he was. With a deep, shaky breath, Daniel took a step forward. The figure stopped, as if sensing his resolve. Its head tilted to the side, a grotesque mockery of curiosity, and for a moment, Daniel swore he saw the faintest flicker of recognition in its empty eyes. It was as if the thing was studying him, waiting to see what he would do next. The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening as the air between them seemed to thrum with an unspoken challenge. Another step. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to keep moving. The figure remained still, its shadowy form looming over him, its presence almost overwhelming. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn and run, to flee from this nightmare. But something about the stillness, the way the figure seemed to be waiting for him, gave him pause. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't here to harm him. Maybe it was here for something else. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting, but he pressed forward. One step at a time, he closed the distance between them. His hand trembled as he reached out, fingers hovering inches from the figure's cold, distorted form. His breath hitched in his throat as he prepared for whatever would come next. Would it attack? Would it vanish? He had no idea, but he was about to find out. In that moment, suspended between fear and curiosity, Daniel realized that his choice had been made the moment he saw the figure. He couldn't run. Not anymore. Whatever this thing was, whatever dark truth it held, he had to face it head-on, even if it meant confronting the very essence of terror itself. The space between Daniel and the towering figure seemed to collapse in on itself. His heart pounded so violently that he could feel it in his throat, and each breath he took was like inhaling ice. The figure stood impossibly still, its grotesque frame half-crouched to avoid brushing the ceiling. Its long, bony arms hung at its sides, fingers twisted unnaturally, as though they had been broken and healed in all the wrong directions. The air around it seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if reality itself struggled to contain the presence of this thing. Daniel's hand hovered inches from the figure's skeletal form, and for a moment, time stretched infinitely. His mind was screaming at him to pull back, to flee, but his body refused to obey. The figure remained silent, motionless, but the sense of impending doom thickened with every second that passed. Then, just as his fingertips brushed the cold, impossibly smooth surface of its arm, the figure moved. It was sudden, so fast that Daniel barely had time to react. The figure's head snapped up, its hollow eye sockets locking onto his, and a sound escaped its maw, a guttural, rasping hiss, like the sound of air being forced through lungs that hadn't breathed in centuries. The sheer volume of it sent a shockwave through Daniel's body, making him stumble backward. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The figure straightened to its full height, towering over him, its head almost grazing the ceiling now, its skeletal body contorted and unnatural. The room around them darkened, shadows creeping from every corner, as if the figure was drawing the very light out of the space. Its presence warped the air, bending the very fabric of reality. Daniel could feel the floor shift beneath his feet, the walls seemed to close in, and the ceiling loomed lower, as though the house itself was being swallowed by the thing's influence. It was no longer just a figure standing before him. It was a living void, a black hole of terror that threatened to consume everything around it. Suddenly, without warning, the figure lunged. Its movements were not human, too fast, too fluid, like watching something move in a distorted, broken frame of reality. Daniel barely had time to register what was happening before he felt its icy grip clamp around his wrist, fingers like iron shackles locking him in place. The cold was unbearable, sinking deep into his skin, spreading through his veins like liquid nitrogen. His breath hitched, and panic surged through him, but he couldn't move, couldn't pull away. The figure's face, or what remained of it, was inches from his now. Its skull-like features were more horrific up close, a grotesque mockery of a human visage. Its skin was pulled tight over the bone, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing jagged, broken teeth. But what truly terrified Daniel was its eyes, or rather, the void where eyes should have been. Staring into the empty sockets was like gazing into an abyss, a darkness so deep and infinite that it threatened to pull him in, to erase him entirely. A low, growling sound emanated from deep within the figure, vibrating through Daniel's very bones. He could feel its breath, or the absence of it, on his face, a chilling vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth from his body. Then, it spoke. The voice that came from the figure was like nothing Daniel had ever heard. It wasn't a sound so much as a sensation, a grating, dissonant noise that bypassed his ears and drilled directly into his mind. The words, or what he assumed were words, were distorted, incomprehensible, but they carried with them an overwhelming weight, a feeling of absolute dread. It was as though the figure was speaking in a language not meant for human ears, a sound that could shatter sanity if heard too clearly. Daniel's mind buckled under the pressure of the noise, his thoughts scattering in 1,000 directions. Every primal instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but his body refused to respond. He was paralyzed, trapped in the figure's cold, suffocating grasp, his vision blurring at the edges as the air seemed to thin around him. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, that his mind would snap under the weight of the terror, the figure released him. It happened so suddenly that Daniel stumbled backward, gasping for air, his chest heaving as if he'd been underwater for hours. The coldness that had gripped him lingered, a deep chill that settled into his bones and refused to leave. He backed away, his legs shaky, but the figure did not follow. Instead, it stood there, still and silent once more, its empty eyes watching him with an unreadable intensity. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The darkness around them seemed to retreat slightly, and the oppressive weight in the air lightened. But Daniel knew deep down that whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished. It was waiting, watching, biding its time. He could feel it in his gut, a gnawing certainty that this was only the beginning. With trembling hands, Daniel fumbled for the door, his mind racing with a single thought: escape. He needed to get out, to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. But as his fingers closed around the doorknob, a whisper echoed through the room, a soft, rasping sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's not over." The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but Daniel knew it had come from the figure. He didn't dare look back. With a burst of adrenaline, he yanked the door open and fled into the night, the cold air outside biting at his skin as he ran, never daring to look back at the house, where the shadows still pulsed with a dark, malevolent presence. Daniel ran through the night, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far he got from the house, the oppressive weight of the figure's presence still clung to him. His mind was racing, replaying the horrific image of that grotesque, skull-like face, and the voice that echoed in his head like a bad dream. He was outside now, under the cold night sky, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He stumbled to a stop in the middle of a deserted road, his heart pounding, sweat dripping down his back despite the cold. The silence of the night seemed unnatural, too still, as if the world had fallen into an eerie, breathless pause. But then it hit him. This wasn't just a random encounter. The figure had spoken, whispered in that guttural voice. It's not over. There was something more, something deeper that Daniel hadn't understood. He leaned against a tree, his hands shaking as he tried to collect his thoughts. Why had it let him go? Why hadn't it killed him or done something worse? And why did it feel like this wasn't the end of the nightmare, but only the beginning? He thought back to the house, to the eerie sense of familiarity that had gnawed at him the moment he'd stepped inside. It was more than just a haunting. There was an intelligence behind the figure, a purpose that he hadn't yet uncovered. As much as he wanted to run, to forget about what had happened, there was something that pulled him back. He needed answers, and he realized with growing horror that the only way to get them was to confront the very thing that had nearly driven him to madness. With a deep, shaky breath, Daniel turned and began walking back toward the house. His footsteps echoed in the silent night, and the further he walked, the colder the air seemed to become, like he was descending into a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. When the house came back into view, it was darker than before, as though the shadows had swallowed whole. The windows were black voids, the door slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for his return. Steeling himself, Daniel pushed open the door, his heart racing. The house was exactly as he had left it, silent, still, and drenched in an overwhelming sense of dread. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and immediately the temperature dropped. It was colder than ever, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. He could feel it now, stronger than before. The figure was still here, watching him, waiting for him to come back. With every step, the house seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the shadows thickening. He moved down the hallway, back toward the basement door, his mind a blur of fear and determination. The door loomed ahead, darker than the shadows around it, and Daniel knew that whatever answers he sought lay on the other side. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob once again, cold sweat slicking his palm. The door creaked open, revealing the stairs that descended into the basement. The darkness there was absolute, thicker than any night Daniel had ever seen, but something about it called to him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn, as if the answers he sought were waiting in the depths. As he took the first step down, the cold intensified, and he could hear faint whispers echoing through the air, soft, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind from a great distance. He descended slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, until his feet touched the cold cement floor of the basement. The air here was suffocating, thick with a damp, musty smell that clung to his throat. But as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw it, a faint, ghostly glow emanating from the far corner of the room. He moved closer, heart pounding, until the glow revealed something carved into the floor, an intricate, swirling symbol, glowing faintly with a pale, otherworldly light. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if a dozen voices were trying to speak at once. Daniel stumbled back, his head throbbing with the overwhelming noise, but he couldn't take his eyes off the symbol. The glow pulsed, brighter and brighter, until it filled the room with a cold, blinding light. And then, from the shadows behind him, the figure emerged once more. It was different this time, more solid, more real. Its grotesque form seemed to shimmer in the glow of the symbol, its hollow eyes fixated on Daniel with an intensity that made his blood run cold. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating him with a sense of dread that was almost unbearable. The whispers grew louder, the sound twisting and distorting in Daniel's mind until it was like nails scraping against his sanity. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Daniel understood. The figure wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was something far older, far more malevolent than he could have imagined. The symbol on the floor was a binding, an ancient mark that had kept the figure trapped in this house for centuries. But now, Daniel had broken the seal. The figure hadn't let him go earlier. It had marked him, connected him to itself in a way that could never be undone. The moment he touched it, the moment he felt that icy grip, he had become a part of its world. As the realization hit him, the figure's mouth stretched open in a grotesque grin, the jagged teeth gleaming in the cold light. The whispers fell silent, and in the deafening stillness, the figure stepped toward him, its skeletal fingers outstretched. This time, Daniel knew there was no escape. The figure wasn't bound to the house anymore. It was bound to him. With a final, despairing scream, Daniel was swallowed by the darkness, the figure's cold grip pulling him into the shadows where no light could ever reach. And as the house fell silent once more, the whispers began anew, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to break the seal. The terror wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence that followed Daniel's disappearance was suffocating, a void where sound and reality seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The house stood as it always had, outwardly unchanged, yet within its walls, the air was thick with something far darker, something ancient. Days passed, then weeks, and the world outside continued without noticing that Daniel had vanished. But the house remembered. Inside, the figure remained, lurking in the corners where the light never reached, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. The glow from the strange symbol on the basement floor had faded, leaving behind only a faint, ghostly outline, barely visible to the naked eye. It had served its purpose. Daniel had unlocked something, broken a seal, and now, whatever had been trapped here was no longer bound to the house. But the world outside wasn't aware of what had been set free. Daniel had gone missing without a trace, and his family assumed he had simply left town, overcome by whatever demons had chased him in life. The police search had turned up nothing, no body, no signs of struggle. To them, it was just another cold case, the kind that fades from memory over time. But Daniel's family knew something was wrong. His absence was too sudden, too strange. Yet even they didn't know the truth of what had happened. Far from the house, Daniel was still alive. At least, part of him was. He wandered through a strange, nightmarish landscape, a place where the sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds and the ground seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. It was a realm of shadows, where the horizon bent in ways that defied logic, and the very air seemed to hum with a low, unsettling frequency. He didn't know how long he had been here. Time had lost all meaning. Hours, days, even years could have passed, and he wouldn't have known the difference. All Daniel knew was that he was trapped, and the figure was always close by watching. It never spoke, never moved quickly, but was always there, just at the edge of his vision, lurking in the periphery, waiting for the moment when his guard would slip. Every time he looked directly at it, the figure would disappear, only to reappear somewhere else, closer than before. It was a game, a twisted cat and mouse that Daniel knew he couldn't win. He wasn't sure if this place was real or if he had descended into some kind of waking nightmare, but he knew one thing for certain. The figure had dragged him here, to this realm that existed somewhere between life and death. It was a prison, one that he could never escape. And with each passing moment, the boundaries between his thoughts and the figure's presence seemed to blur. It was as though the figure wasn't just watching him, it was becoming a part of him. Back in the house, the strange occurrences began to escalate. Those who dared enter the house, curious teenagers, thrill seekers, or even the occasional trespasser, reported hearing strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They would speak of the cold, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones, no matter how warm the day had been. But most unsettling of all were the sightings. People claimed to have seen a tall, shadowy figure standing in the hallways, its gaunt frame hunched to avoid hitting the ceiling, its hollow eyes following them as they moved. Some said they had seen the figure move, slowly at first, its skeletal arms outstretched as if reaching for them. Others claimed that the figure never moved at all, but they could feel its presence, a crushing weight of dread that made it impossible to breathe. The local legend of the house grew, whispers of it being cursed, haunted by something far worse than a ghost. But no one truly knew the nature of the entity that resided within, except Daniel. As the months passed, the sightings grew more frequent. Those who entered the house began to report strange occurrences in their own homes afterward. They would wake in the dead of night, certain that something was watching them from the corner of their bedroom. Some claimed to have seen glimpses of the figure in reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, even the darkened screen of a television. It was as though the entity had followed them home, its presence seeping into their lives like a sickness that couldn't be cured. Then, one night, Daniel's family received a letter. It was postmarked from a distant, unknown place, the handwriting scrawled and barely legible, but it was unmistakably Daniel's. The letter was brief, only a few sentences, but its message chilled them to the core. It's not over. It's with me, and it's coming for you next. The family was gripped with terror. They had long suspected that something dark had happened to Daniel, something beyond the realm of the natural. But this was a nightmare made real. The letter's arrival marked the beginning of strange happenings within their own home. The same cold spots, the same eerie whispers in the night. And then they too began to see the figure. It was always in the shadows, just out of sight, but always watching, always waiting. The truth was terrifyingly clear. The figure wasn't bound to the house anymore. Daniel had become a part of it. And now, the terror that had haunted the old house for so long was spreading, reaching out to claim more victims. The figure would never stop. It was relentless, an ancient evil that had been freed from its prison, and now it sought new prey. The terror had only just begun, and there was no escape. The house remained, quiet and still, a relic of a forgotten past. But those who knew the truth stayed far away, knowing that once you entered the house and made contact with the figure, there was no going back. Daniel's fate was sealed, and now the figure was on the hunt for the next soul to claim. And one thing was certain, no one would be safe until the figure's dark hunger was finally satisfied. But would it ever be? Months had passed since Daniel's family received the cryptic letter, and the darkness that followed him seemed to spread like a shadow creeping across their lives. The figure, once confined to the old house, was no longer bound by its walls. Now, it lingered in the corners of their homes, in the moments between sleep and wakefulness, watching, waiting. They never saw it directly, just fleeting glimpses in the corner of their eyes. A tall, grotesque silhouette standing in the shadows, always just out of reach, but unmistakably there. Every night brought the same sensation, a deep, suffocating dread that pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe. Daniel's parents, once skeptical of the supernatural, could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease that filled their home. Doors would creak open on their own. Cold drafts would sweep through rooms where no windows were open. And, most disturbingly, they could hear soft whispers in the dead of night. The whispers were faint, almost inaudible, but they were always the same. Daniel's voice, repeating those chilling words, "It's not over." His younger sister, Sarah, was the first to notice the figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows playing tricks on her as she walked down the hallway late at night. But the more she ignored it, the more persistent it became. She started seeing it everywhere, standing at the foot of her bed when she woke up in the middle of the night, reflected in the bathroom mirror, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its head bent at an odd angle, as if the ceiling wasn't high enough to contain it. Its hollow eyes, those dark voids, seemed to follow her wherever she went. And no matter how fast she looked, no matter how quickly she turned her head, it was always gone before she could truly see it. The figure never spoke. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to drive Sarah to the edge of her sanity. Every night, she would lie awake, terrified to close her eyes, knowing that the moment she did, the figure would be there, standing over her, watching her in the darkness. She tried to tell her parents, but they brushed it off as nightmares, the stress of losing her brother weighing on her. But Sarah knew the truth. Daniel wasn't gone. Not completely. He was still with them, trapped in some kind of liminal space, and the figure was the key to all. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of something moving in her room. Her heart raced as she sat up, the blankets clutched tightly in her hands. The figure stood at the foot of her bed, its skeletal form towering over her. But this time, it didn't vanish when she blinked. It stayed unmoving, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. The figure's presence was suffocating, as if it were draining the very warmth from her body, leaving nothing but a cold, empty void behind. For the first time, Sarah heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried on the wind. It was Daniel, his voice, distorted and distant, calling out to her from somewhere far away. "Help me," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to scream, to call out to him, but her throat was tight with terror. The figure took a step closer, its long, bony fingers outstretched toward her, as if beckoning her to follow. Suddenly, everything made sense. The figure wasn't just a haunting. It was a gateway, a conduit between their world and whatever dark place Daniel had been pulled into. It wasn't trying to harm her. It was showing her the way, leading her to him. But the thought of following it, of stepping into the darkness with the figure, filled her with a terror she couldn't shake. What would happen if she went with it? Would she be trapped like Daniel, forever lost in that shadowy realm between life and death? The figure remained still, waiting for her decision. Sarah could feel its cold, oppressive energy pressing down on her, urging her to act. But before she could make a move, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The room was silent once more, the cold retreating, leaving Sarah alone in her bed, trembling with fear and confusion. In the days that followed, Sarah became obsessed with finding answers. She scoured old books, researching everything she could about spirits, entities, and otherworldly beings. She visited psychics, paranormal investigators, anyone who might have a clue as to what was happening. But no one had ever heard of a figure like the one that haunted her. No one knew how to bring someone back from the place Daniel had been taken. Meanwhile, the figure continued to haunt her. It appeared more frequently, always at night, always in the corners of her vision. Each time, it grew bolder, staying longer, standing closer, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. And each time, she could hear Daniel's voice, growing more frantic, more desperate. "Help me, Sarah, please. It's not over." As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's resolve began to crack. She knew she couldn't keep running from the figure forever. It was only a matter of time before it came for her, just as it had come for Daniel. But part of her couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a way to save him, that the figure was the key to freeing him from whatever dark realm he was trapped in. Finally, one night, Sarah made her decision. She sat on the edge of her bed, waiting for the figure to appear, her heart pounding in her chest. When it finally did, standing in the doorway, she didn't flinch. She didn't run. Instead, she stood up, took a deep breath, and stepped toward it. The figure's empty eyes seemed to light up with a dark, hollow energy as Sarah approached. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the figure's cold, bony fingers. Instantly, the world around her shifted. The room dissolved into shadows, and she felt herself being pulled into a cold, dark void. But through the darkness, she could hear Daniel's voice, louder and clearer than ever before. "Thank you." And then everything went black. Back in the waking world, the house stood silent once more. Sarah was gone, just like Daniel, leaving no trace behind. But the figure remained, its hunger growing, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, to step into its grasp. Because, as Daniel had said, it's not over. Not yet. The terror was just beginning.